Sometimes, a child's silence holds more truth than a room full of speeches. And when that silence breaks, only for a dog, you know something bigger is at stake. This is the story of a little girl, a loyal dog, and a broken world trying to tear them apart. But what no one expected was how far that bond would go to fight back. The sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed through the stuffy, packed hall of the Willow Ridge Community Center, jolting some attendees upright in their seats. The bright overhead lights glared down on rows of serious faces, wealthy businessmen, community members, officers in uniform, and media holding their cameras steady. The air buzzed with whispered conversations and the rustling of bid sheets, but none of the noise reached Lila Bennett. 7 years old and heartbreakingly quiet, Lila clutched the chipped pink ceramic piggy bank against her small chest. Her fingers trembled. Coins clinked gently inside. Her knuckles were white from holding it so tight. And her eyes, wide and shimmering with tears, were locked on the one thing she hadn't taken her gaze off in years. Ranger, the massive German shepherd, stood leashed on the other end of the hall. His ears perked sharply, his eyes darting across the crowd before landing on Lila. Something inside the dog stirred the moment he saw her, a shift in his posture, a quiet, low whine that broke through the murmuring audience like a ghost of sorrow. Ranger was not just a dog. He had once been the proud canine partner of Officer Noah Bennett, Lila's father, who had been killed in the line of duty 5 years earlier during a routine operation gone horribly wrong. Since that devastating day, Lila had not spoken to another human being. Not once. Her world had closed like a heavy book, sealed shut by grief. Except for Ranger. He was the last living thread between Lila and her father. He had been there. He had seen it all. He had survived. And he had stayed close to her in the aftermath, silent, loyal, watchful, until the day he was taken away. And now, he was up for auction. $40,000, the auctioneer called out, his voice booming like a cannon blast. Do I hear 45? The crowd tensed as paddles began rising again. Across the room, Victor Hale, a tall man in a navy suit with a sharp jawline and a colder heart, didn't even blink as he raised his number placard. Hale, CEO of Hale Sentinel Security, had made it clear he wanted Ranger for his elite private force. Rumors swirled that Ranger had been trained to detect sensitive chemical compounds, making him valuable to certain pharmaceutical companies Hale had contracts with. To Lila, none of that mattered. To her, Ranger was Dad's dog. Dad's best friend. And hers. 50,000, someone else shouted. Lila's grip on the piggy bank tightened. She sat between her mother, Helen Bennett, and her stepfather, Tom Grayson. Helen's eyes brimmed with tears she refused to let fall. She reached around Lila, placing a soft, trembling hand on her daughter's back, but the girl didn't move. Didn't look. Her entire being was locked in a silent scream, one the crowd couldn't hear, but Ranger did. Ranger tugged at his leash suddenly, surprising the officer holding it. A soft, throaty whine escaped him again, sharper this time. The crowd turned, murmurings rising, cameras tilting. His handler pulled back, trying to calm him, but it was too late. The room had noticed. Is that the Bennett girl? Someone whispered. That's the dog, right? From the cop who died? Helen's breath caught in her throat. Lila's eyes welled up. Ranger locked eyes with her again, and for a moment, the entire crowded, chaotic hall melted away. It was just a little girl and her dog. And then the bidding continued. 55,000, came the voice of Victor Hale, smooth and unshaken. Tom Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Helen noticed the flicker in his eyes, not of sadness, but of relief. He had never quite understood the bond between Lila and Ranger. To him, the dog was a relic of pain, keeping the girl anchored to a trauma that had long passed. She needs to move on, Tom had whispered in arguments Helen refused to revisit. But Helen knew. She knew Ranger wasn't a barrier to Lila's healing. He was the only path forward. Lila's tiny hands began to shake more violently now. She leaned forward, resting the piggy bank on her lap. Inside it were coins she had saved over the last 5 years. Birthday money. Tooth fairy coins. Pocket change she picked off the floor. All of it, every cent, was for this moment. But it wasn't enough. 60,000, came a new voice from the back of the hall. It was Samuel Cross. A rugged, soft-spoken rancher known to the town for his reclusive ways and quiet generosity. He was the last person anyone expected to be at an auction, let alone bidding. Heads turned. Cameras shifted. Even Helen blinked in surprise. "What is he doing here?" she whispered. Samuel sat with a calm expression, nodding toward the auctioneer without a word. His presence stirred something in Helen's chest. She didn't know why, but she suddenly felt a sliver of hope. 60,000 going once, the auctioneer said. Ranger's handler eased the leash as the dog relaxed, but his eyes never left Lila. Going twice. Sold. The gavel slammed down. To bidder 32, Samuel Cross. Applause broke out in the room, some out of curiosity, others unsure what exactly had happened. But to Lila, it was all just noise. She stared at the man in the back, then back at Ranger. He was still hers, right? Or was this goodbye all over again? Her hands gripped the piggy bank tighter, knuckles bone white. Helen bent down, whispering gently, "We'll figure this out, sweetheart. I promise." Lila didn't reply. But in her heart, a flame flickered, small, desperate, but still burning. Please, she thought. Please don't take him away from me. Please let this be the beginning. The silence inside the Bennett home wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. Cold. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around everything, curtains, picture frames, doorknobs, and made even the floorboards creak more somberly. Lila sat by her bedroom window, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the soft fall of snow outside. Her pink piggy bank, now slightly chipped at the base from the tension of her grip earlier that day, sat beside her on the windowsill. She hadn't spoken a word since they returned from the auction. Across town, Samuel Cross sat quietly in his cabin, staring at a simple slip of paper with the winning auction number, bidder 32. His weathered hands turned it over again and again. On his table, a steaming cup of untouched tea sat next to a folder filled with documents that were never meant to be seen. His jaw tightened. He hadn't just bid on a dog, he had stepped into something deeper, older, and far more dangerous. Back at the Bennett household, Helen stood silently in the doorway of her daughter's room, watching. Lila's expression hadn't changed. Her shoulders drooped slightly more than usual. Her fingers picked at the soft fur of a worn stuffed animal that had belonged to her since before her father passed. It had been 5 years since Officer Noah Bennett died. But time had not dulled the edges of his absence. If anything, it had sharpened them, especially for Lila. Helen crossed the room and sat beside her daughter on the floor. She didn't say anything. Words had lost their power a long time ago. Instead, she just placed her hand gently over Lila's, grounding her in the warmth of presence. In another corner of the house, Tom Grayson stood near the kitchen counter, arms crossed. He was listening. Always listening. And lately, always worrying. Not about Lila, at least not in the same way Helen did, but about the unraveling grip he had on the family. Tom hadn't expected Ranger to still hold this kind of sway over the girl. In his eyes, the dog was a relic, a stubborn shadow of grief. He believed that by letting go of the dog, Lila might finally be able to step into the light again. But Helen knew differently. Ranger wasn't an anchor pulling her daughter down. He was the only bridge left between a little girl and the father she lost too soon. Helen's thoughts drifted back to that horrible night, the night everything changed. A routine operation gone sideways. A bullet where there shouldn't have been one. The call she received just after midnight. The officer's voice shaking on the other end. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. Officer Bennett. He didn't make it. But the dog, Ranger, survived. He's being brought in now." That night had broken something inside her. And it had shattered Lila. In the months that followed, Lila stopped speaking entirely. No screaming. No sobbing. Just silence. Except for when she was alone with Ranger. Then, from behind bedroom doors or in the corner of the yard, Helen would hear the soft murmur of a child whispering into fur. Words only Ranger would ever hear. That bond had kept her daughter alive. And now, that bond was being threatened by a man who only saw dollar signs. Victor Hale. Helen's heart darkened at the thought of him. He wasn't just any bidder. He was dangerous in a way that was hard to prove but easy to feel. She had seen the kind of pressure he could apply. And she had seen the kind of people who worked for him. And then there was Samuel Cross, the wild card. She didn't know why he had stepped in. Didn't know what his interest was. But when her phone buzzed with a strange number later that night, she had a feeling it wasn't a wrong number. "Mrs. Bennett?" The voice was deep, steady, and unfamiliar. "Yes? This is Samuel Cross. We haven't met, but I think we need to talk." Helen hesitated. "About what?" "Ranger. And Victor Hale." The pause on her end was heavy. "I'll meet you tomorrow," she finally said. At May's diner. Noon. That night, the snow fell heavier. In her room, Lila sat awake holding the only photo she had left of her father. In it, Noah knelt down smiling, his hand on Ranger's head. Both looked proud. Whole. Unbreakable. Lila traced their faces with her finger. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just held the photo and whispered so softly even the snow outside couldn't hear. "Please come home." The next morning, the town of Willow Ridge woke to a thin sheet of frost covering the streets like forgotten sorrow. Snow still clung to rooftops, and the bare trees outside May's diner stretched against the pale morning light like tired bones. Helen Bennett stepped inside, brushing melted snowflakes from her coat, her eyes scanning the nearly empty room. Only one man sat in the far booth, Samuel Cross. He rose politely when she approached. "Mrs. Bennett," he greeted with a quiet nod. His voice was calm but carried weight, like someone who chose each word with care. "Just Helen," she replied, sliding into the booth. "You've got my attention, Mr. Cross. Now tell me why you bought my daughter's dog." Samuel's face didn't change. He reached into his coat pocket and laid a folded envelope on the table. "Because your daughter's dog might be the last thread of evidence tying a very dangerous man to your husband's death." Helen blinked. "What?" Samuel leaned forward slightly. "Your husband, Officer Noah Bennett, was investigating Zenith Biolabs before he died. A case he never got to finish. But I believe what he uncovered was never an accident. And neither was his death." Helen sat back, stunned. "You knew Noah?" "No," Samuel said. "But my daughter, Sarah, did." Helen froze. Samuel's fingers curled around his coffee cup. Sarah worked at Zenith. A lab tech. Smart. Quiet. Brave. She found records. Dangerous ones. A list of illegal compounds being tested in human trials. She went to HR, and they told her they'd investigate. A week later, she was dead. "Car accident," they said. He looked up now, eyes dark and steady. "But I don't believe in coincidences." Helen's throat tightened. She could barely whisper. "Noah said something. Right before that night. He told me there was a pharmaceutical case he couldn't talk about. But that it was big. I didn't think. Your husband and my daughter crossed paths through that investigation," Samuel said softly. "And Ranger was part of it. He was trained to detect a specific chemical compound Zenith was using in their experiments. I believe that's why Victor Hale wants him." Helen went still. "You're saying Ranger is evidence?" Samuel nodded. "Living, breathing evidence. And Hale is determined to keep him silent." Helen felt her breath catch. Her hands gripped the edges of the table. "That dog is the only thing keeping my daughter from going completely silent," she said. "If they take him." "They won't," Samuel said firmly. "Because I have a plan." Back at the Bennett home, Lila sat cross-legged in the living room, staring at a worn photo album. Ranger's old collar, faded and scratched, lay beside her. Her fingers traced the letters of her father's name on the metal tag, whispering a soundless mantra only Ranger would understand. Her eyes shifted to the front door every few minutes, as if she knew something was coming. And she was right. That afternoon, Helen returned home with a determination Lila hadn't seen in her since Dad died. She knelt in front of her daughter, cupping her face. "I met someone today," she said. "He knew Dad's case. He knew about Ranger. And he's going to help us." Lila's eyes widened just a little. "He's not just helping us bring Ranger back," Helen continued. "He's helping us bring justice." Lila didn't speak. But her hand found Helen's, and for a moment, she squeezed tight. A signal. A silent promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Meanwhile, across town, Tom Grayson stood in the kitchen, staring at his phone screen. An email sat open. It was from Victor Hale's assistant, thanking him for his discreet efforts in redirecting public support away from the Bennett campaign and Ranger's custody. Tom's heart sank. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. But now, it was too late. Helen stepped into the kitchen, holding a printed copy of the email. "What is this, Tom?" she asked quietly. Tom's face turned pale. "Helen, you were helping him?" she said, voice trembling. "After everything this family has been through? After everything Lila has lost?" "I thought I was protecting her," Tom said, trying to stay calm. "I thought Ranger was keeping her trapped in the past." Helen shook her head slowly. "You don't understand her at all." There was a long, unbearable silence. And then Helen said what neither of them had expected to say aloud. If you can't stand with us now, then you don't belong here." That night, Helen sat beside Lila, brushing her daughter's hair as she whispered stories about Noah. Some Lila had heard before. Some she hadn't. But tonight, the girl listened more closely than ever. When Helen kissed her forehead and stood to leave, Lila's small hand reached out and caught her wrist. "Mama?" she whispered. Helen froze. Lila hadn't spoken a word in 5 years. Tears rushed to Helen's eyes. She dropped to her knees. "Yes, baby?" Lila looked up, eyes shimmering. "Don't let them take Ranger." The next morning, the cold in Willow Ridge felt sharper, as if the truth they were about to unearth had frozen the air itself. Helen Bennett drove through the outskirts of town in silence, her hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Beside her, Samuel Cross sat with a worn leather folder resting on his lap and the lines of worry deeper than ever etched into his face. They were headed toward a weathered farmhouse nestled near the edge of the woods, a place where the past refused to stay buried. It belonged to Tom Abrams, a former employee of Zenith Biolabs, and once a trusted colleague of Samuel's daughter, Sarah. The tires crunched over gravel as the house came into view, barely visible through the mist curling through the trees. It looked like something from another time, but Helen could feel it in her gut, something important waited inside. Samuel knocked once. Then twice more. The door creaked open. A man in his 60s stood in the doorway, wearing a heavy flannel jacket and a face carved by time. His eyes flickered over Samuel, then paused on Helen. "You said it was about Sarah?" he asked quietly. Samuel nodded. "And Noah Bennett." Tom stepped aside. "Then come in." Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old books. The walls were lined with dusty shelves and faded newspaper clippings. Helen scanned the room, catching glimpses of articles about whistleblowers, lawsuits, cover-ups. Tom gestured toward the table. "Sit. I need you to understand something before we go any further." Helen sat. "We're listening." Tom reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick file, marked with a red tab. He placed it between them. "This," he said, "is what Sarah died for. And what your husband was about to die for." Helen felt her breath catch. Tom opened the file. Inside were photocopied memos, charts, emails, technical data, and a photo of a vial labeled ZB47X. "A trial drug," Tom said. "Not FDA approved. It wasn't even supposed to exist. Zenith was using it on undocumented patients, mostly homeless and elderly, under fake clinical trial titles. They buried the deaths under unrelated diagnoses. Sarah found this batch, this formula, and tried to stop it." He looked straight at Helen now. "Noah got wind of it from the department's narcotics list. He was investigating the movement of certain chemical traces showing up at crime scenes. Traces only Ranger could detect." Helen's eyes widened. "So Ranger was the link?" Tom nodded. "The dog picked up the compound on a suspect during an unrelated arrest. That's how Noah traced it back to Zenith." Helen glanced at Samuel, her chest tight. "And Victor Hale?" Tom's expression darkened. "He's not just a security consultant. He's Zenith's fixer. Hale's company was paid to suppress investigations, eliminate liabilities, and sanitize whistleblowers. Sarah was one. Noah was the next." A long silence followed. The truth settled over the table like dust. Helen's voice cracked when she finally spoke. "Do you have proof Hale's still after Ranger?" Tom nodded, sliding over a printed internal memo with the Hale Sentinel logo. Subject: K9 decommissioning timeline, urgent priority, ensure transfer by Q1. Below it, a list. Ranger's identification code sat at the top. Helen closed her eyes. Her head spun. And suddenly, everything made sense. The pressure. The auction. The unusually high bids. Tom's betrayal. It wasn't about the dog. It was about silencing a witness. Back home, Lila sat by the window again, her hands resting on her lap, eyes empty. But inside her, something had changed since the night before. She had spoken. And her voice had cracked open something that had been buried for 5 years. She now understood what it meant to fight. Not just for Ranger, but for her dad. She rose quietly and walked to her father's study, the one Helen kept closed like a sacred shrine. Inside, the air was heavy with old paper and memories. Photos lined the shelves, plaques from Noah's service, a folded flag in a glass frame. Lila walked slowly to her father's desk and sat. She pulled out a drawer. Inside was a notebook. On the first page, "If anything happens to me, Follow Ranger's nose. Later that night, Helen returned home. Her coat was soaked, her hands cold, but her eyes carried fire. She found Lila curled up in bed, Ranger's old collar clutched to her chest. Helen sat beside her and began speaking, not to explain, not to instruct, but to include. "We're going to court," she said. "To fight for Ranger. But it's more than that now. We're fighting for Dad." Lila looked up, quiet but resolute. Helen reached into her bag and pulled out the evidence folder. "We have what we need. We just need to be brave." And Lila, for the first time in years, nodded without hesitation. The next morning, Helen made one more stop, the sheriff's office. Sheriff Nolan Beck, an old friend of Noah's, leaned back in his chair as she laid the documents on his desk. "These aren't just rumors anymore," Helen said. "They're trying to erase what my husband found. And that dog is the only one who remembers." Sheriff Beck stared at the papers for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone. "Get me Councilwoman Fields," he said. The town hall of Willow Ridge looked different that morning. Gone was the quiet formality of council meetings or zoning reviews. Today, every folding chair was filled. Locals, reporters, off-duty officers, council members in suits. And at the front, just behind the long wooden table, stood a German shepherd named Ranger, ears forward, posture alert. And beside him, her fingers gripping the leash like it was a lifeline, sat Lila Bennett. Her mother, Helen, sat on one side. Tom Grayson, quieter than usual, on the other. And in the center of it all, presiding over the special hearing, was Councilwoman Anna Fields. To one side of the room, Victor Hale stood tall, dressed like a man who believed he'd already won. Flanked by lawyers, arms folded behind his back, his cold stare never left Ranger. Behind him, Samuel Cross stood silently in his leather jacket, eyes narrowed, watching everything. The proceedings began with procedural statements. The legal counsel outlined the petition. The Bennett family was requesting permanent civilian placement of a retired K-9 officer, Ranger, with Lila Bennett, a minor. The sheriff's department had yet to decommission the dog, citing policy that required certified adult handlers. But as Councilwoman Fields looked across the room, it was clear this wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about truth, and justice, and legacy. Sheriff Nolan Beck was the first to speak. "With all due respect," he began, his voice gravelly and tired, "Ranger is a highly trained officer. Search and rescue. Narcotics. Apprehension. He isn't a pet." Murmurs filled the hall. "But," Sheriff Beck continued, "he's also the only being this little girl has spoken to in 5 years. And frankly, I've seen human officers with less loyalty and control." He stepped back. Councilwoman Fields nodded and called the next witness. Dr. Caleb Monroe, Lila's longtime therapist, approached the podium. "Lila exhibits symptoms of trauma-induced selective mutism," he explained. "Traditional therapy yielded no improvement until regular interactions with Ranger resumed. Her emotional regulation, verbal expression, and social engagement drastically improved in the dog's presence." He paused, then added, "Removing Ranger now would be a regression so severe, I'd consider it medically damaging." Victor Hale's lawyer stood immediately. "While we sympathize with Miss Bennett's condition, the town must consider long-term liability. This is an animal with law enforcement-grade training. There are frameworks for a reason." That's when Samuel Cross rose and stepped forward. Heads turned. "I've established a legal trust," he said. "It covers training oversight, insurance, and quarterly evaluations. Certified K-9 handlers will monitor Ranger under Lila's care. This is not charity. It's structured, documented guardianship." Councilwoman Fields raised an eyebrow. "Why would you go to such lengths, Mr. Cross?" Samuel hesitated only a moment. "My daughter, Sarah Cross, died under suspicious circumstances tied to Zenith Biolabs, a company now protected by Mr. Hale's firm. Officer Noah Bennett was investigating that case. Ranger was part of it. And Hale, he's not here because he cares about dogs. He's here to erase what Ranger knows." The room went still. Victor Hale stood sharply. "That's a slanderous accusation." Samuel raised a single hand and gestured toward Helen, who stepped forward, placing the evidence folder on the table, internal Zenith documents, whistleblower memos, and a report connecting Ranger's scent detection history to the banned compound ZB47X. Councilwoman Fields opened the folder slowly, her face unreadable. "We will review this evidence thoroughly," Then she turned to the center of the room. "Miss Bennett. Would you like to speak?" All eyes turned to Lila. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Lila's fingers tightened around the leash. Ranger sat calmly beside her, head leaning into her side like he'd done every night since her father's death. She stood slowly. And for a moment, it looked like she might not say anything. Then, her voice, though quiet, filled the room. "He's not just a dog," Lila said. "He was my dad's partner. He helped my dad find people. Catch bad guys. He helps me sleep. He helps me remember my dad." She looked directly at Hale. "And he helps me talk." The silence that followed cracked something inside every heart present. Even Councilwoman Fields had to blink away moisture in her eyes. "We've heard enough," she said softly. "The council will now enter closed deliberation." Outside, the air felt tenser than ever. Helen wrapped Lila in her coat as Samuel, Tom, and Sheriff Beck stood quietly nearby. Inside the hall, debate raged on behind closed doors. Victor Hale made one last attempt. He approached Helen. "If you walk away now," he said calmly, "I'll let this fade. I won't pursue charges. But if you keep pushing, I'll bury you in court for years." Helen smiled, calm, sure, unshaken. "You already tried burying one member of this family," she said. "You're not getting another." 20 minutes later, the doors opened. The council filed in. Councilwoman Fields stood. "In light of the extraordinary testimony, evidence, and proposed oversight, we rule unanimously in favor of permanent civilian placement of Ranger under the Bennett family." The room erupted. Applause. Tears. Flashbulbs. Relief. Helen pulled Lila and Ranger into her arms, sobbing. Tom wiped tears from his eyes as he placed a quiet hand on Lila's back. And Samuel stood silently, heart heavy, but proud. The wind had picked up in Willow Ridge that evening, brushing past rooftops and scattering thin layers of frost across porches and parked cars. But inside the Bennett home, warmth returned for the first time in years. Not because of the fire crackling in the hearth, but because Ranger was home. He walked through the front door like he belonged there, as if time hadn't pulled him away, as if absence hadn't tried to erase his place. His paws barely made a sound on the wooden floor as he entered, stopping just before the coffee table. His nose twitched. His head tilted. Then he walked straight to Lila, who stood in the hallway like a statue, her eyes locked on him. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, without a word, Lila dropped to her knees and buried her face in Ranger's fur. Her body trembled as her small hands gripped his neck. Ranger didn't move. He only pressed his head into her shoulder and released a soft, slow breath. Helen watched from the kitchen, tears silently sliding down her cheeks. Tom stood behind her, arms crossed tightly, still unsure of how to fit into the picture, but no longer trying to remove himself from it. The house felt alive again. Later that night, Helen sat at the dining table, the evidence folder spread in front of her. Ranger lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head as if checking she was still there. The court had ruled in their favor, but it wasn't over. Victor Hale wouldn't just disappear. And Zenith Biolabs certainly wouldn't go down quietly. Helen knew it was time to make the documents public. She reached for her laptop. In Lila's room, the girl lay on the floor beside Ranger. She wasn't asleep, but she was quiet, breathing slowly, her fingers buried in his thick coat. She had spoken at the hearing. She had found her voice again. But tonight, a different kind of silence surrounded her. Not the cold, heavy silence of grief. This one was soft. Safe. She turned to Ranger. "Do you remember Dad's voice?" she whispered. The dog didn't answer, but he didn't have to. His ears flicked. His head nudged closer to her cheek. "I think I do too now," she said. Meanwhile, Helen opened her inbox and began drafting an email to a trusted local journalist who had been following the case from the edges, Mira Delgado. Subject: The truth about Officer Noah Bennett. Mira. You've asked for interviews. I wasn't ready then. But I am now. Attached is everything: Zenith, Hale, the cover-up, the files my husband kept in secret. He died chasing this truth. It's time others knew why. Helen. She hesitated for only a second before hitting send. The next morning, Sheriff Nolan Beck called. "You just started a fire," he said calmly. Helen didn't flinch. "Good. Maybe now people will pay attention." He sighed. You've made enemies. Hale still has pull. If you need protection. I have Ranger, Helen replied. And I have the truth. There was a pause. Then Nolan's voice softened. He'd be proud of you. By noon, Myra's article was trending online. The badge, the dog, and the truth buried in Willow Ridge. The headlines were everywhere. Ranger's photo. Noah's story. Lila's courtroom words. Everything was public. And that meant Hale would strike back. Sure enough, that evening, a black SUV with tinted windows was parked down the block. It didn't move. Didn't even have its engine running. Just waited. Samuel Cross called to check in. I saw the article, he said. I also saw the SUV near your house. Helen's voice was calm. Let them watch. Just be careful, he said. These men don't leave witnesses. Helen looked out the window at Lila and Ranger playing together in the backyard. They already failed once, she whispered. Back inside, Lila opened her father's old notebook again. And there it was, a name circled in red ink. Dr. Mira Halverson, Zenith Biolab's internal compliance, flagged whistleblower. We need to find her, she told Ranger. The dog's ears twitched. Outside, the SUV was gone. But Lila had already made up her mind. The fight for Ranger might be over. But the war for truth was just beginning. The wind howled across Willow Ridge the next morning, but inside the Bennett home, Lila was already awake. She sat on the floor, her legs tucked beneath her, the old notebook from her father open in front of her. Her finger circled the name again and again. Dr. Mira Halverson. Zenith Biolabs, internal compliance, terminated. Beside her, Ranger shifted, lifting his head and resting his chin on her leg. Helen stepped into the room with a soft knock. You're up early. Lila looked up, her eyes determined. We have to find her. Helen hesitated. Then nodded. I agree. Downstairs, Helen called Samuel Cross, who answered on the second ring. I've heard the name, he said. She vanished a few months after Sarah died. No paper trail. No forwarding address. I have one lead though. A woman who worked with her. Camilla Jansen. Teaches ethics at a university now. I can get you the contact. Helen nodded. We'll go. By noon, Helen and Lila were on the road, Ranger's head poking between the seats as the countryside gave way to the rusted edges of the university town. It was quiet, too quiet for a place that once buzzed with youthful chaos. They parked beside a dull brick building and walked in, Ranger trotting confidently beside them. Professor Camilla Jansen opened her door warily. I know why you're here, she said before they could speak. Inside, her office was lined with books about justice, law, and corporate responsibility. On the wall hung a framed photo of Mira Halverson beside a graduation ceremony. She was my closest friend, Camilla said. But when she blew the whistle on Zenith's internal trials, she became a target. After the accident with Sarah Cross, Mira knew she'd be next. She ran. I haven't seen her since. Helen's voice was steady. Do you know where she went? Camilla pulled out a slip of paper. She mailed me this. Postmarked from a small town upstate. Didn't say much. Just. If anything happens to me, the dog knows. Lila's eyes widened. Camilla looked at her. You're the daughter, aren't you? Lila nodded. Camilla reached into her drawer and handed Lila a small brass key. She trusted me to give you this if you ever came. That night, back in Willow Ridge, Lila placed the key on the table. It had a tiny engraving, SH, 17. Helen stared at it. Storage? Locker? What does it mean? Lila looked at Ranger. And Ranger got up. He walked to the back hallway. Then stopped at the closet door. Helen opened it. Inside, taped under an old coat hook, was a small metallic tag. Locker 17. State Highway Bus Depot. Just 2 hours north. The next morning, they were back on the road. At the dusty depot, Locker 17 creaked open to reveal a black folder, labeled only. Last test batch, ZB47X. Inside, dosage sheets, lab rat results, human trial memos, and a final page, handwritten in Myers' scrawl. If you're reading this, I may already be gone. Please finish what Noah started. This isn't just about science. This is about the people they think no one will miss. You already found the dog. Now find the doctor who trained him. Back in town, Sheriff Nolan Beck called with urgency. There's been a break-in. Mira Halverson's old apartment. Someone searched it last night. Helen froze. Victor Hale? She asked. Possibly. But get this, he's been seen near your place. You need to be careful. Helen gripped the phone tightly. I won't run. Then stay visible, Nolan warned. They won't strike in public. And keep that dog close. She hung up. Ranger looked up from where he lay beside Lila. His ears were perked. His eyes alert. He already knew. That evening, Helen called Myra's name into every known whistleblower channel she could find. Forums. Backdoor lists. Underground networks. Then, one message came back. Meet me. One night only. No phones. No files. Just the dog. Coordinates attached. Lila's heart pounded. Helen nodded slowly. They were getting closer. They were stepping into a trap. The trees thickened the farther they drove. What began as paved road soon gave way to gravel, and then gravel gave way to dirt. The coordinates Mira had sent didn't match any town or structure on Helen's GPS. Just a dot in the middle of the map, nestled somewhere between state forest boundaries and abandoned ranger trails. Lila sat in the back seat, clutching the black folder they'd recovered from the storage locker. Ranger, ever vigilant, leaned against her leg, eyes fixed out the window. He hadn't relaxed since they left Willow Ridge. Something was bothering him. Helen glanced in the rearview mirror. You okay back there? Lila nodded once. Ranger's tense. So am I, Helen whispered. It was almost sunset when they reached the gate, a rusted archway that once bore a sign, now too weathered to read. A narrow path stretched into the trees, just wide enough for them to walk through. Helen parked the car off the road. We go on foot from here. With the folder in her backpack and Ranger leading the way, the three of them moved deeper into the woods. Every snap of a twig felt louder than it should. Every shadow stretched longer than it needed to. After 20 minutes, they reached a clearing. In the center stood an old cabin, its roof sagging, windows boarded, but smoke curling faintly from the chimney. Ranger froze. He sniffed the air. Then began walking, not toward the door, but around the cabin. Helen followed, hand instinctively reaching for her pepper spray. Behind the cabin, there was a trapdoor, wooden, half buried beneath leaves. Lila stepped forward. She's down there. Helen hesitated, then knocked. Nothing. Knocked again. A voice, hoarse and low, came from beneath. How do I know you're not with them? Helen didn't answer with words. She stepped aside and let Ranger bark. There was a long pause. Then the latch clicked. The trapdoor opened, and for the first time in 5 years, Dr. Mira Halverson emerged from hiding. Her hair was longer, grayer than in the photos. Her eyes were tired but clear. When she saw Lila, she gasped. You're Noah's girl, she whispered. You found me. Lila nodded. Mira reached out, touching Ranger's face. I never thought I'd see you again, she said. You saved me once before. Looks like you've done it again. Inside the cabin, Mira poured tea with shaky hands. I've been off the grid since the accident, she said. After Sarah died, and then Noah. I knew I'd be next. But I couldn't let their work disappear. She pointed to a metal crate in the corner. Helen opened it. Inside, vials, sealed test kits, printed dossiers, all original documentation of the Zenith experiments. Human test logs. Video stills. Transfer memos. Names of executives. And most importantly, evidence that Ranger had detected the compound before it was ever listed as illegal. He's not just a witness, Mira said. He's the timeline. Helen's stomach twisted. And Hale? Still hunting anyone who can tie him back to the early trials, Mira said. But you have something he doesn't. She turned to Lila. Your voice. Just then, Ranger growled. Low. Deep. A warning. Helen looked outside. A black SUV rolled into view at the tree line. Lights off. No sound. Mira stood quickly. Go through the back. Follow the stream. There's a safe house 2 miles north. But what about you? Lila asked. I'll stow them. Helen shook her head. We stay together. No, Mira said firmly. This isn't just about surviving. It's about getting the truth out. And they already know where I am. They don't know about the rest of you, yet. Ranger barked again. Louder. More urgent. Then a voice boomed from outside the cabin. Dr. Halverson. You know how this ends. It was Victor Hale's men. Helen grabbed Lila's hand. Run. Now. Ranger led the way, bolting through the rear door and into the woods. Branches tore at their clothes. The stream glistened in the moonlight ahead. Behind them, gunshots cracked the silence. But they didn't stop running. They couldn't. They had to make it to safety. Because now, they didn't just carry the story. They carried proof. The forest seemed quieter once they reached the stream. Helen's boots splashed through the cold water as she pulled Lila across, gripping her hand tightly. The girl's fingers clutched the black folder against her chest, its contents dry but dangerously fragile. Behind them, Ranger pushed forward without hesitation, glancing back every few steps as if counting heads. They didn't stop running until the trees opened into a small clearing, and a weather-beaten shack stood hidden beneath the shadows of cedar branches. The safe house. It had once been an old ranger post, long since abandoned by the state but maintained quietly by men like Samuel Cross who knew that someday, someone might need it. Helen burst through the door first, checking corners like instinct. It was empty. But intact. Wood stove. Cots. Water pump. Radio, dusty, but functional. Ranger rushed in behind them, circled once, then dropped in front of the door, ears alert. Lila collapsed onto the cot, gasping. Helen placed the black folder on the small wooden table. Then locked the door. For a long time, they didn't speak. They just listened, to Ranger's breathing, to the wind outside, to the distant ache of danger that hadn't yet found them. Finally, Lila sat up. "Do you think she's okay?" Helen didn't lie. "I don't know." They both knew Mira had stayed behind to buy them time. Whether she was alive now was a different question. Helen crossed the room and opened the black folder again, laying out the documents across the table. It was a damning collection. Internal memos. Sent logs from Ranger's police K-9 file. Human trial spreadsheets. All dated. All linked. All real. But there was one thing missing. Something Helen hadn't seen yet. And Lila noticed it too. "There's no name for the head scientist," she said quietly. Helen looked closer. There were dozens of names. Researchers. Analysts. Interns. But one set of initials kept repeating, RK. Lila grabbed the notebook her father left. Flipping to the back, she ran her finger down a list of acronyms. At the bottom, RK equals Dr. Ryan Keller, Chief Compound Architect, ZB-47X Program. Terminated publicly. Reinstated via Hale Sentinel under alias. Helen blinked. "Alias?" she whispered. Lila pulled out her phone and typed Ryan Keller into an encrypted search browser. One result showed an old photo. Another listed a recent appearance at a security conference under a different name, Dr. Kyle Redden, lead consultant, Hale Sentinel Chemical Research Division. Helen froze. He changed his identity. They buried him inside the company, Lila said. Ranger suddenly barked, one sharp sound. Helen looked out the window. A drone hovered just beyond the tree line. Not military. Corporate surveillance. "They've found us." The power went out. Instantly, the radio crackled. Helen reached for the emergency lamp and turned it on. Then something strange happened. Ranger walked to the wall and pawed at the boards. Helen stepped closer. Behind one plank, tucked into a carved groove, was a hidden flash drive, sealed in waterproof plastic. A note was rubber banded to it: "If this is found, send it to the press. You'll know where." Helen took the drive, slipped it into her jacket, and turned back to Lila. "We're not running anymore," she said. "We're going to end this." They used the remaining battery on the burner phone to call Myers' contact, listed only as Felix. A deep voice answered. "You have the drive?" "Yes," Helen replied. "Then get to the highway. Mile marker 118. Look for a rusted truck with the name Barrow Haulage. Slide the package into the tire well." Helen hesitated. "That's not exactly secure." "You want secure?" the voice said. "This is hell we're dealing with. Don't think safe. Think seen." Then the line went dead. That night, they packed everything. Flash drive. Documents. Food. Emergency flares. Helen checked her revolver. Lila checked Ranger's GPS tag and switched to stealth mode. They had maybe 1 hour before Hale's people descended. Ranger stood at the door. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just stood, watching. Waiting. Like he knew. Tomorrow wouldn't be just another escape. Tomorrow, they were going to fight back. The road to mile marker 118 was a long stretch of nothing. Gray fog hugged the pavement like a ghost. The morning sky hung low, the sun barely breaking through the cloud cover. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Helen drove without speaking. Lila sat beside her, holding the flash drive in one hand and the black folder in the other. Ranger sat behind them, head on the armrest, eyes always scanning. There were no signs of pursuit. But that didn't mean they weren't being followed. They reached mile 118 just after 8 a.m. The shoulder was wide, with a slope leading to a narrow tree line. Just past that, a rusted semi-truck bearing the word Sparrow Haulage sat idling quietly, its engine making a low mechanical hum. No driver in sight. No movement. Helen stepped out first. She looked around, no cars behind them. No footprints. Just silence. Lila approached the truck cautiously, glancing at the tires. "Here," she whispered. She crouched and slid the waterproof pouch, flash drive, map copy, and a note from Mira, into a small magnetic case attached under the wheel well. Then she stood, brushing dirt from her knees. And waited. Minutes passed. Then the truck blinked its right turn signal twice. Then 3 short flashes. It rumbled forward, slowly, until it disappeared over the ridge. That was it. No words. No faces. But the message was clear. The truth was in motion now. Back in the car, Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Helen turned to her. "It's done." "No," Lila said. "It's started." Ranger nudged her arm gently, as if agreeing. By the time they reached backroads outside Willow Ridge, everything had changed. News was breaking. Multiple journalists had already received the data dump. An anonymous package. Time-stamped photos. Witness logs. K9 scent detection timelines. Trial footage. Memos showing Victor Hale's involvement in the silencing of whistleblowers and unregulated testing. Social media exploded with the headline, "Truth Buried in Willow Ridge, the dog who knew too much." But even in that moment of impact, danger lingered. That evening, Sheriff Nolan Beck called them to his office. Inside, Samuel Cross was already waiting, arms crossed, eyes tired but calm. "You shook a tree," Nolan said. "Now the roots are panicking." He turned the monitor toward them. On it, a leaked internal memo from Hale Sentinel: "Engage emergency asset removal protocol. Eliminate primary witnesses. Begin asset recovery, K9 128. Ranger." "They're coming," Nolan said. "Let them," Helen replied. But Lila had a better idea. "We go public," she said. "In person." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You mean speak?" Lila nodded. "If I show up, on camera, with Ranger, people won't just see a story. They'll see a girl who got her voice back because of a dog they tried to erase." Helen looked at her daughter. Not fragile. Not afraid. Just ready. The next morning, they stood outside the Willow Ridge courthouse, where cameras waited and reporters swarmed. Helen held Lila's hand. Ranger stood tall at her side. And when the microphones were placed in front of her, Lila took a breath and began to speak. "My name is Lila Bennett," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I lost my dad 5 years ago. He was a good man. He died trying to protect people. This dog, Ranger, was his partner. He protected my dad, and then he protected me." She paused. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't stop. "And when they tried to take him from me, I learned how to fight." She held up a photo of Noah with Ranger. "I speak now. Because of him." Behind the cameras, Victor Hale watched. Expression unreadable. But the fear in his eyes betrayed what he knew. This wasn't just a girl and a dog anymore. This was a movement. For the first time in weeks, the Willow Ridge courthouse steps felt calm. Lila stood beside her mother and Ranger as flashes from news cameras lit her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She had spoken. And now, the world listened. The story had spread beyond local news. National channels picked it up. Global journalists requested interviews. The internet erupted with hashtags. Hashtag the dog who spoke, hashtag justice for Noah, hashtag protect Ranger. But not everyone celebrated. Victor Hale had gone silent. His publicist offered only one line: "These claims are under legal review." But insiders knew. His empire was crumbling. Inside the sheriff's office, Nolan Beck paced. "They're pulling contracts left and right," he said to Helen. "Hale Sentinel is bleeding. Myra's records broke their credibility overnight." Helen leaned forward. "What about the scientist? Ryan Keller?" Samuel Cross, standing in the corner, replied quietly, "Interpol has flagged his alias. They'll find him." "What about Mira?" Lila asked softly from beside Ranger. Nolan hesitated. Then said, "She made it. She's safe. Witness protection. But she asked me to give you this." He handed Lila a sealed envelope. She opened it slowly. Inside, a photograph of Mira and Sarah, standing in front of a lab building, smiling. A note scribbled on the back. "Some truths don't need microphones. Just hearts brave enough to carry them. Thank you, Lila. And thank you, Ranger. MH." But the danger wasn't gone yet. One morning, as Helen stepped out to pick up groceries, her tire had been slashed. Later, a threatening message was left on her porch, no words, just a photo of Ranger with a red X drawn across it. It was the last gasp of a dying empire. A desperate move. But it made one thing clear. Victor Hale wasn't finished. That night, Helen filed for a restraining order and brought in local officers to keep watch. Samuel had Ranger microchipped again, this time with a dual-frequency GPS beacon linked directly to Sheriff Beck's phone. "We're not taking chances," he said. Meanwhile, Lila began working on something of her own. She opened a blog, titled The Partner Project. Her first post. "This is for the kids who lost someone but didn't have the words. This is for the dogs who stayed even when the people left. This is for every silent room that found a bark before it found a voice." Lila and Ranger, paw prints emoji. It went viral overnight. Thousands of families submitted stories of canine heroes, emotional support dogs, and animals who had saved lives, sometimes literally, sometimes quietly. Lila read every story. And Ranger sat beside her the entire time. But Hale's silence wasn't surrender. 2 weeks later, during a live TV interview with his legal team, he smirked when asked if he feared prosecution. "Prosecution?" he said. "I built the systems that fund half their campaigns." And just like that, he said too much. The next day, 2 state attorneys filed official subpoenas. Financial audits began. A deeper investigation opened into Zenith Bio Labs. It was the spark that set fire to the paper palace. And when it began to collapse, it collapsed fast. But the final blow came from the most unexpected place. A recording, one no one had known about, leaked to the press. In it, Hale could be heard instructing Keller. "Erase the dog. The girl's a mute. The mother's weak. If the shepherd dies, the rest unravels." That sentence went viral. It was the end. By the next morning, Victor Hale was arrested on obstruction, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to suppress federal investigations. Photos of him being led away in cuffs with his tie crooked and expression hollow ran on every news outlet in America. That evening, Lila placed Ranger's badge next to her dad's. She looked up at her mom. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" Helen smiled through tears. "He already is." The leaves had started to turn golden in Willow Ridge. For the first time in what felt like forever, the Bennett house didn't feel like a fortress or a war room. It felt like home. The windows were open. The air smelled like cinnamon. Lila's laughter rang through the hallway, not loud, not forced, but real. Ranger lay curled on the living room rug, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor whenever Lila passed. Helen stood in the kitchen, making pancakes, an old tradition once lost, now found again. A photo of Noah stood on the windowsill beside a fresh cup of coffee. She poured a second mug and set it beside the picture. It was a quiet ritual. But it mattered. Down the street, a new plaque was being installed outside the community center. Canine Ranger and Officer Noah Bennett, partners in service. Guardians in silence. And next to it, a second smaller plaque. In honor of Lila Bennett, who found her voice and used it. The story had reached everywhere now. Schools invited Lila to speak. Canine organizations reached out to honor Ranger. Helen was offered a guest op-ed in the New York Times. But they declined most appearances. Because what they really needed now was just a little time to be normal. That didn't mean they stopped fighting. The Partner Project exploded. It became a platform not just for stories, but for resources. Counseling support. Canine adoptions. Therapy grants. People donated. People healed. Lila kept writing. One day, a letter arrived from Mira. "I watched your speech on an old TV in the middle of nowhere. I cried harder than I thought I could. You didn't just expose Hale. You proved that silence doesn't mean weakness. Tell Ranger thank you for me. I'm safe now. And I owe you everything. MH. Lila read it aloud. Then kissed Ranger on the head. You hear that? She whispered. You saved her too. Ranger responded with a soft yawn and curled closer to her. Later that night, Lila walked out to the backyard. The stars stretched wide and endless. She looked up. Then down at the compass her stepfather, Tom, had given her the night of the hearing. The one that had belonged to her dad. She opened it. It still worked. She whispered to the sky, I found my way back. Ranger barked softly. Back inside, Helen tucked Lila in. She paused at the doorway. You know, she said, you don't have to keep telling this story if you don't want to. Lila smiled. I do want to. She reached over, gently placing her hand on Ranger's paw. I want people to know that sometimes, all it takes is one dog to remind you you're not alone. That night, the Bennett house glowed. Not with electricity or flashbulbs, but with peace. With hope. With the quiet, loyal breathing of a dog who never gave up, and a girl who finally learned to speak. And that was the story of Lila and Ranger, the dog who guarded more than just a home. He guarded a voice, a family, and the truth. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more true and emotional stories of animal heroes, resilience, and the bonds that save us. Orange heart emoji, like, share, and comment below if you believe dogs are more than pets, they're protectors of the soul.